Mr. Acting Speaker, I am a baby boomer. I am from the rebellious generation. When they had short back and sides, we had hair down to our shoulders and long sideburns. We were the generation of protest. We protested against apartheid. We protested against Vietnam. We protested against the laws that made homosexuality illegal. We protested against the destruction of the environment and urban environment. We were opinionated as we were progressive in our views. We were dismissed by the previous generation as just being the views of youth without the experience of life. And as you can imagine, I was somewhat more opinionated than most. But to give effect to my views, I, at a young age, joined the Labor Party, and at the age of 27 got elected to public office and became the mayor of my local council. I did so to try and give effect to my progressive views. Some think it's unusual that I happened to finish up as a member of the New South Wales Right, but nevertheless I continued to espouse those views, but I learned something in public office, and that is, and in all the decades I've served in public office, is that it is not good enough to be right. It is not good enough to be right. You need to take people with you. You need to take people with you on a journey, because ultimately those of us in public office are only in public office and only govern with the consent of the people. And when I look at the journey of the baby boomers generation, we've taken a lot of people along a pretty long journey that with views that were seen to be well and truly extreme progressive views are now probably the right of mainstream thinking. I mean, and in fact, it started with the election of the Whitlam government in December 1972. Voluntary assisted dying is the next step along that journey. And as I have to consider this bill, I have to decide whether or not this bill is the appropriate vehicle to take the next step along the journey. I want to thank all those who had an input into the view that I ultimately take. I want to thank all those constituents who took the time of writing to my electorate office and expressed their views both in favour or opposed to the bill. I want to thank various of my parliamentary colleagues who also expressed their views passionately and respectfully in relation to this bill, and the many organisations that wrote to me or contacted me, both religious and otherwise, and I thank them for their view. I'd like to single, though, some people out with the time and effort they made to try and convey their views to me. Firstly, Rabbi Pinchas Feldman, the titular head of the Chabad, probably one of the most knowledgeable and ultra-Orthodox rabbis in Australia, who provided me with detailed papers and advice on the Jewish law relation to voluntary assisted dying. To the Honourable Greg Donnelly from the other place, who was passionately opposed to this bill and provided me with a considerable amount of material, most of which I read, and I thank him for his time and his effort in conveying his views. To Andrew Constance, because I listened to his contribution to this bill, of which he spoke without a note, and I found what he had to say to this House compelling, and I thank him for his contribution. To the member for Ku-ring-gai, who I know has a particular view and has spent a lot of time going through the bill and has spoken to me repeatedly in relation to his view and his amendments. I thank him for his time and his effort and the issues that he raised, and I'm grateful, I don't know how successful it was, that I ultimately got him and the members for Sydney to have at least a reasonable conversation with a view of reaching some compromise. And most significantly, Dr. Joe McGurr, the member for Wagga, whose words he passed on to me will haunt me as I vote in the division on this bill. The people who have expressed a view I've put into basically three classes. Firstly, those who value human life and say it's paramount and no one has a right to take a human life or assist someone taking a human life. Secondly, those of faith who believe that only God has the right to decide who lives and dies. And thirdly, those who believe that any person has a right facing a terminal illness to be able to die with dignity at the time of their passing. Each of those people who fit into those three broad classes have a substance in the views of which they express, who passionately believe in those views, and I respect them for expressing those views. It is argued by those opposed to the bill that there has been a complete failure of palliative care in this state, and that there is no reason that any person should die in pain should palliative care be resourced, and that is the solution. The member for Wagga said to me, and I say these words will haunt me, that his grave concern is that the failure of palliative care will result in rural and regional areas of people selecting to die rather than experience the pain because of failure in palliative care. Now, apart from the fact that the member for Wagga is a very honourable person, he is from the health service and he understands in rural and regional areas what the impact of people who are in that position without palliative care is. And so consequently, his view and his concerns cannot be easily dismissed. And as I say, his words, and I can't repeat them with the calm precision of the member for Wagga, but they will haunt me as I walk into this chamber and cast my vote. There has been a complete failure of aged care in this country. For those who didn't appreciate it beforehand, since the Aged Royal Commission, the way in which this nation and this state treat its elderly people who are in care is probably one of the most shameful, embarrassing things within this country. When I say the word disgraceful, I am underestimating it. You know, Australia prances around the world and advocates human rights, and countries, totalitarian nations who don't adhere to human rights, and we treat our elderly in care in the way in which we have. We should hold our head in shame because, in fact, our conduct has been proved on the evidence to be reprehensible. Secondly, our failure in palliative care. I think the Premier spoke for us all when he conceded that terrible failure in palliative care and that there needs to be substantial improvements. How we in a humane society could leave people die in excruciating agony simply because some heartless Treasury boffin is not allocating sufficient funds is disgrace. Not only a disgrace to the government of the day, previous governments of the day, and those of us in opposition who have remained silent for far too long. And we should be listening to the people like the member for Prospect, who's made it his mission to fight for people who suffer, people who don't have access to palliative care. And it is a shame on all of us as members of this House. And I accept that. And I accept that the Premier was genuine in him espousing the view he probably espoused on behalf of all of us. I might just ask at this stage, might have an extension of time, Mr.
Member for Heffron's requests an extension of time. All those in favour say aye. Against say no. The ayes have it. The ayes have it.
The problem is that the problem is, in respect of that argument, is you cannot conflate failure of aged care and a failure of palliative care as an issue to replace whether or not you agree on voluntary assisted dying being permitted in this state. Now, Mr Acting Speaker, you've probably distilled that I have, from a young age, always believed in the right of somebody to voluntarily terminate their life. I cannot accept that a person who is terminally ill cannot decide to terminate their life at a time of their choosing and cannot be assisted in providing it is voluntary. And it is voluntary. The question is whether it is voluntary. That is the key. And that has been my concern, and I know it's been the concern of a number of people when this sort of bill was proposed before. All of us know, as we have, unfortunately, those of us have been in the experience of watching a dying parent dying in pain or dying in difficulty. We know from our own parents that they don't want to be a burden on their children. I don't want somebody to decide to terminate their life because they don't want to be a burden. They don't want to be a burden on their children. That's not voluntary. That is not voluntary. At the same time, people also have a right to be able to die, people who are terminal and are going to die in dignity, and to decide at what point they wish to pass away. You know, I've got the authority to disclose this to the House because it came from the member for Rockdale, who his father passed away suddenly. So the passing away of his father had nothing to do with it. But he had told his son, he had said to his son these words, and I quote, "Don't let anyone wipe my ass, son," unquote. And I think that says it all. A person has a right. A person has a right the person has a right to decide to terminate their life rather than undergo the lack of dignity, the pain or the suffering that they are about to undergo, providing we are sure that they are terminal and that they genuinely choose to want to terminate their life. It is not sufficient to deny somebody that opportunity. In respect of some of the amendments that purport to go to voluntariness, I will consider them fairly. There's some issues being raised. I mean, the Honourable Greg Smith contacted me concerned about the prosecution power being with the Department of Health. But, you know, I read the DPP Act and I saw the Director of Public Prosecutions can take over any criminal proceedings in this state. The concern about whether or not there is anything untoward and what the investigative power is, there is nothing in this bill that takes away the ability of the Coroner of New South Wales for investigating a death in circumstances under the Coroners Act. So you know, you're not going to be able to coerce somebody improperly, and there's going to be no particular mechanism for an examination if anything untoward occurs. I've looked at the effort from the member for Sydney. I have looked at the way in which he's heard and listened to everybody and accommodated a number of amendments and continues to accommodate a number of amendments. No bill is perfect. No law this Parliament passes is ever perfect. In fact, it's usually far from perfect. But in my view, what has been proposed to this House by the member for Sydney and those other co-sponsors have done as good as they possibly have to provide for the inbuilt protections necessary for this bill to pass. Finally, after a number of decades, I can say that as far as voluntary assisted dying is concerned, its time has come.
Mr Speaker.
Thank the member for Heffron. The question is, this bill now be read a second time. I call the member for Coffs Harbour.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Yesterday marked the 3-year anniversary of my